Those chord stabs, those deep basses, those punchy drums, they just have a certain vibe.
You know how it is, right? You're into music tech, always eager to learn more, but sometimes wading through all the info out there can feel like a real slog.
Yeah, you just want the good stuff, the insights that really make a difference without drowning in a sea of specs and details.
And that's exactly what we're all about here, cutting through the noise and getting to the heart of what matters.
Exactly.
Today, we're into something that's not just a fascinating piece of music production history, but something that still has a huge impact on how music is made today. Akai's S-Series samplers.
Oh yeah, the Akai S-Series,
Yes.
absolute classics.
For this dive, what we want to do is really get to grips with the key models in the Akai series. We want to figure out what made each one so important, explore how they changed the way people were making music. So let's jump in right back to the beginning.
Okay, so that takes us to 1985. The arrival of the Akai S612, the very first in the S-Series lineage.
The OG Akai sampler.
Now, by today's standards, the specs might seem a bit basic. 12-bit sampling, 6-note polyphony, and you could only sample for about 8 seconds max. But for its time, it was a huge step towards making sampling technology more accessible.
Right, because before that, sampling was pretty much exclusive to those high-end, super expensive studio setups.
Exactly. So the S612, even with its limitations, it really paved the way for more affordable samplers and opened up a whole world of creative possibilities.
It's funny how those early limitations, that 12-bit crunch, actually became part of its appeal.
Yeah, it gives it a certain character, a kind of rawness that you don't really get with the super clean, high-fidelity sound of modern samplers.
It's almost like a happy accident.
Kind of, it wasn't necessarily intentional, but it definitely became part of its sonic signature.
And there's a little fun fact about the S612. It was the only one in the entire S-Series that didn't have that classic off-white, almost beige look.
Really?
Yeah, the original SX12 was black, a bit of a stylistic oddball.
Huh, interesting. Okay, so moving on, just a year later, in 1986, Akai releases the S900.
Okay, the S900. So this is still 12-bit, but they bumped up the polyphony to 8 notes, right?
That's right. And it could store up to 32 different samples. But the really cool thing about the S900 was the variable sample rate.
So you could choose between higher quality and longer sample time.
Exactly. You could go for the full 40 kilohertz if you wanted the best sound quality, or you could dial it all the way down to 7.5 kilohertz if you needed to squeeze out more sample time.
Wow, and how much of a difference did that make?
Oh, it was a huge jump. Remember, the S612 only gave you about 8 seconds. Well, with the S900, you could get almost 12 seconds at the highest quality setting, which is pretty good.
That's a decent increase.
But get this, if you were willing to go down to that lowest quality setting, you could get a whopping 63 seconds of sample time. Yeah, it really opened up a whole new world of possibilities, especially for genres like hip-hop and electronic music, where sampling was becoming so central to the sound.
And they also made some significant changes to the hardware, didn't they?
Absolutely. The S900 came standard with 8 mono outputs, which was a huge deal for routing flexibility. Producers could send different sounds to different effects units, different channels on the mixing desk.
So much more control over the sound.
Exactly. And there was also an optional 8-input trigger board you could get for it, which really expanded its capabilities for drum sequencing and triggering external gear.
So with all these upgrades, is it fair to say that the S900 was Akai's first truly professional sampler?
I'd say so, yeah.
Yeah.
It really cemented their position in the professional market and set the stage for what was to come. The Akai S700 sampler.
From 1987.
Yeah, 1987. It seems like a bit of a hidden gem.
It definitely has its fans.
For sure, even though it's kind of, I guess you could say, overshadowed by some of the other samplers that were coming out around the same time.
It was a bit of a different beast, a rack mount unit, actually, spun off from Akai's X7000 keyboard.
Right, a rack mount sampler. So not something you'd see on a stage, more like tucked away in a studio.
Exactly. And it was known for being pretty user-friendly, especially compared to, say, its predecessor, the S612.
Okay, so easier to use. But what could it actually do? What were we working with here?
Well, let's get into the specs. We're talking about a sampling frequency range of 4 to 32 kilohertz.
Okay, so that's how many times per second the sampler is capturing the sound, right?
Exactly. And it had a max sample time of 8 seconds.
8 seconds total. Wow, that's not a lot to play with.
Especially by today's standards, no. It also had 6 voices of polyphony.
6 voices.
That's right. And for storage, we're going way back in time, 2.8-inch quick discs.
Quick discs. Wow. Haven't heard that name in a while.
They're totally obsolete these days. Good luck finding those.
So not exactly the most practical format for modern music making. And what about the actual sampling quality?
At its highest bandwidth, 16 kilohertz, you could get a max of 6 samples, each zero point 0.8 seconds long, and those were mono samples.
Mono, so no stereo sampling. Okay, starting to get a sense of the limitations here.
And of course, we have to talk about the sound quality.
12-bit.
12-bit.
Yep.
That's definitely lo-fi.
Distinctly lo-fi, you could say.
Okay, so things are evolving quickly, and now we come to the S950. Now, this one came out around the same time as the S1000, which we'll talk about in a bit, but it was really seen as a kind of refinement of the S900, wasn't it?
Yeah, you could say that. The interesting thing is, it stuck with the 12-bit sampling and the 8-note polyphony of the S900.
So no change there.
Nope. But they did tweak the top sample rate. The S950 could go up to 48 kilohertz, which could give you a slightly brighter, more detailed sound.
Especially in the higher frequencies, I imagine.
Exactly. The trade-off, of course, was that you got slightly less sample time at that highest quality setting, down to about 9 seconds.
Okay, so a little less time, but a bit more fidelity.
Right. But they also significantly increased the number of samples you could store, up to 99.
Wow, 99 samples. That's a pretty big jump from the 32 on the S900.
It is, yeah. Gives you a lot more sonic possibilities. But for me, the most exciting thing about the S950 is that it was the first Akai sampler to offer SCSI connectivity.
SCSI?
Yeah, SCSI. Stands for Small Computer System Interface. Basically, it was a way to connect external hard drives and other storage devices.
So not just limited to the internal memory anymore.
Exactly. With SCSI, you could save and load entire libraries of sounds from external drives, which was huge for more complex productions.
That makes sense. You wouldn't be able to do much with 99 samples if you could only fit a few seconds on each one.
Nope. Not unless you really like those super short, grainy samples.
And, of course, we can't forget about the time stretching. The S950 was the first Akai sampler to have built-in time stretching, right?
It was indeed. And that was a real game changer.
It allowed you to change the tempo of a sample without affecting the pitch, or vice versa.
Right, which opened up a whole new world of creative sampling techniques. People were really starting to push the boundaries of what was possible with sampling.
Okay, so the S950 was a significant step forward, but then we get to the S1000. Now, this feels like a real leap in technology, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The S1000 was a major upgrade. It introduced true stereo sampling to the S-Series, and it also moved up to 16-bit resolution. The sound was much cleaner, more detailed, and had a wider dynamic range. Plus, they increased the sample storage to a whopping 200 individual samples. That meant without any extra RAM, you could sample for just under 12 seconds in stereo at that CD quality 44.1 kilohertz.
Oh.
Or you could go up to about 47 seconds in mono at lower 22.05 kilohertz.
So a decent amount of sample time, even without expanding the memory.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, like the S950, it also had that built-in time-stretching algorithm, which was becoming a staple of the Akai sound.
So the S1000 was a real powerhouse, a proper professional sampler.
No doubt about it. It really set a new standard for what was possible with sampling technology.
Okay, so now we move into the early 90s. And Akai, they just seem to be on a roll, releasing a whole bunch of new models. The S2800, the S3000, the S3200, and then, of course, the S3000 XL, probably one of the most popular models in the whole series.
Yeah, the S3000 XL, a real classic. But what's interesting is even though they released all these different models, there was a definite trend towards more power, more flexibility for producers.
So kind of building on the foundation laid by the S1000.
Exactly. These models, they all featured 32-voice polyphony, which was a big step up from the 16 voices of the S1000, and they could handle up to 255 individual samples.
So more voices, more samples, more possibilities.
Right. And they also started including digital effects and resonant filters as standard features.
Which really opened up the sonic possibilities.
Big time. Suddenly, you could do so much more sound design right there on the sampler itself.
Okay, so we're starting to get a clear picture of this evolution of the Akai S-Series. But then, just when you think you've got it all figured out, they release the S2000. Now, it has a higher number in the name, but it was actually positioned as a more affordable entry-level option, wasn't it?
Yeah, the S2000 was a bit of an odd one. Despite the name, it was actually released after the S2800 and S3000, and it was specifically designed to be a cheaper alternative.
So kind of like Akai's answer to the growing demand for more affordable sampling technology.
Exactly. And it still had some pretty impressive features, like it still had that 32-voice polyphony, expandable RAM, and the digital effects.
Sounds pretty good for a budget model.
Yeah, it wasn't bad at all. But to keep the price down, they did have to make some compromises.
Okay, so we're nearing the end of the S-Series timeline now. It's the late 90s, early 2000s, and Akai releases what would be their final flagship models, the S5000 and the S6000.
Oh yeah, the big boys.
These were the top-of-the-line, no-compromise machines, aimed squarely at the professional market.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the S5000 and S6000, they were pretty similar at their core, right? But the S6000 had some significant upgrades, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. For starters, it had a higher maximum polyphony, 128 voices, compared to the S5000's 64 voices.
So you could create even more complex arrangements.
Absolutely. And it also had double the number of analog outputs, 16 compared to the S5000's 8.
Wow, 16 outputs. That's a lot of routing options.
It is, yeah. Gave you a huge amount of flexibility for integrating with external effects and mixing consoles.
And there were some physical differences too, weren't there? Like the S6000 had a removable screen.
It did, yeah. Which could be really handy for editing from a distance, especially in a larger studio setup.
And an extra drive bay, I think.
Yeah, more storage options never hurt.
So both incredibly powerful machines. So let's fast forward to the present day, and here's where things get really interesting. Because despite all the advancements in sampling technology, those vintage Akai S-Series samplers, they're experiencing a real resurgence in popularity. But there's something about those old Akais that just keeps drawing people back.
There is, yeah. It's not just nostalgia either. There are some really good reasons why those vintage machines are so sought after. The bit depth of the converters, the specific sample rates, the analog circuitry, they all contribute to a certain grit or edge that a lot of producers love.
So it's not that super clean, pristine sound that we've come to expect from modern digital audio.
Nope. And that's the whole point. It's a sound that's become so closely associated with a specific era of music, and people are still chasing that vibe.
And even the early time-stretching algorithms, they had their own quirks, their own artifacts, and those have become desirable in their own right.
Totally. It's like those imperfections are part of what makes them sound so good.
So it's that lo-fi charm, that unique sonic character that you just can't get from a software sampler?
Exactly. That's why models like the S900 and S950, they're still so highly sought after. Producers will actually sample sounds into them just to get that particular sonic flavor, even if they're not using any of the other features.
It's like using them as an effect in themselves?
Kinda, yeah. Like running drums through an S900 can give them this amazing weight and punch.
Huh, that's interesting.
And it's not just the sound either. There's also something about the workflow of using those dedicated hardware samplers that a lot of producers find really appealing.
Ah, so it's more than just the sound, it's the whole experience.
Right. Because with a DIW, the possibilities are almost limitless. But that can be overwhelming for some people. With those older samplers, you have limitations, and sometimes those limitations can actually be really inspiring.
Because they force you to be more creative.
Exactly. You have to work within those constraints, and that can lead to some really interesting and unexpected results. Plus, there's just something really satisfying about working with dedicated hardware. It's tactile, it's immediate, it's just a different way of interacting with sound.
And let's be honest, there's also a coolness factor to having a vintage Akai sampler in your studio.
Oh yeah, definitely. There's a certain romance to using gear that has its own history, its own story. It's like you're connecting with a different era of music production.
So we've talked about the evolution of the machines themselves, but now I want to shift gears and talk about how influential those Akai S-Series sample libraries were, especially in the 90s.
Yeah, they were huge. They were used on so many records, especially in genres like house, techno, and hip-hop.
The excerpt talks about the author's early experience with the S950 and how they were initially more focused on getting as much sample time as possible rather than the specific sonic characteristics of the sampler.
Makes sense, right? When you're first starting out with sampling, you're just excited to capture as much audio as you can. You're not necessarily thinking about the nuances of the sound.
And a lot of early producers were sampling from vinyl records, right?
Oh yeah, that was super common. It was all about digging through crates of records, looking for interesting sounds, breaks, and loops.
And then you had the official Akai sample libraries. Those really took off with the S1000, didn't they?
Yeah, that's when they started becoming really popular. The author mentions that when they first started using those official S1000 libraries, and later the S3000 and S5000 libraries, they didn't immediately have the same impact as the samples they were getting from vinyl.
It's funny how your perspective can change as you gain more experience.
Totally. Looking back, the author realizes that it was probably more about their own production skills at the time rather than the quality of the samples themselves. Because those Akai libraries, they were full of really good sounds.
And there was a definite sonic thread running through them, a particular set of sounds, a particular way of processing them that became synonymous with that era of music.
Oh yeah, definitely. There's a distinct Akai sound, especially from that 90s era. And it's something that's still sought after today.
The author specifically mentions using their S1000 library for those classic house and techno sounds.
Yeah, those chord stabs, those deep basses, those punchy drums, they just have a certain vibe that's hard to replicate with other sounds.
So even though they're from a different era, they still have a place in modern music production.
Absolutely. And with a little bit of modern processing, you can really make those sounds shine in a contemporary context. Like a bit of compression and saturation can go a long way.
So they're not just outdated relics, they still have a lot to offer.
Definitely not. They're full of character and inspiration.
Now, for anyone listening who's thinking, hey, I want to check out those Akai sample libraries, where can they find them?
Well, you can often find the original CD-ROMs on eBay.
Ah, so you got to go old school.
Kinda, yeah. But they're not usually too expensive. And some of those classic collections have actually been archived and made available online.
Really? Where can people find those?
There are a few places, but one good resource is the Internet Archive. They've got things like the Akai CD-ROM Sound Library, Volume 1, which is full of great sounds.
Wow, that's awesome. So people can actually get their hands on these sounds without having to track down the original CDs.
Exactly.
But there's a catch, isn't there? Because those libraries, they're in that proprietary Akai format.
You need to convert them first.
And how do you do that?
It's a two-step process. First, you need to use a tool like Denon Tools to mount the CD image. That basically tricks your computer into thinking that you've inserted the actual CD.
Ah, I see.
And then, once you've done that, you can use a dedicated audio conversion software like Wave Studio to read the Akai format and convert those samples into WAV files.
So it's a little bit of a technical process?
Yeah, it's not quite as simple as just dragging and dropping, but it's not too complicated either.
Cool. So to wrap things up, we've really gone on a journey here, haven't we? We've explored the entire evolution of the Akai S-Series samplers, from that very first S612 to those final flagship models, the S5000 and S6000.
Yeah, it's been quite a ride.
We've looked at the key features, the sonic innovations they introduced, and we've talked about why those vintage machines are still so relevant, even in today's world of incredibly advanced music technology.
And we've dived into the world of those Akai sample libraries, those sounds that defined an era, and how those sounds can still inspire and be used in modern music production.
It's amazing to think how influential those machines and those sounds have been, and it makes you wonder, sometimes those limitations of older technology, they can actually sport creativity in a way that modern limitless tools sometimes can't.
That's a really good point.
Like those Akai samplers, they forced you to be resourceful, to think outside the box, to really work with what you had. And maybe that's part of what made them so special.
I think you're right.
So if you're feeling uninspired, if you're looking for a fresh perspective, maybe it's time to dig into some of those old Akai sounds. You never know what kind of creative sparks they might ignite.
Who knows? You might just stumble upon your next big track.